Welcome to another Professionally Evil Fundamentals. Today we're going to discuss AWS identities and policies. And we wanted to bring this up because over the last couple of years we've noticed a very common set of issues and problems with how permissions are being assigned within AWS environments. So let's start with some key terms. The first one being an account. Unlike what we typically think of as an account, which is, a user's logon information for an application or system, an AWS account is more like an Active Directory domain. It's a large grouping of resources, an entire AWS environment, right? Examples could be a production environment versus a development environment, all right? So if an account is large scale, what provides authentication? Well, that's an identity, right? With an AWS, there's two different types of identities. The first is a user, which is how a user service logs into AWS and interacts with it through the console or CLI or APIs. Users do have passwords, or maybe they have access keys so they can programmatically access AWS. A role, on the other hand, is not a permanent set of credentials, right, to access AWS, but a method that other identities can gain some temporary set of access permissions different than what they would normally have, right? So while you could have one user identity within an AWS account, perhaps you have multiple roles that you could assume to do different sets of activities at different times. A group is really just a way of putting a common set of permissions within or applying a common set of permissions to a large number of users at one time. Instead of taking those permissions and applying them individually to each user account or each role separately, you put the users into a group and you apply the permissions to the group itself. The last key term is the policy, and really these are the permissions within AWS. So policies are those permissions that an identity can take. And there's two different types of policies. There's an inline policy and a managed policy. An inline policy is directly embedded within an identity itself, right? And the only way to see what those permissions are to look at that object, whether that's a user or a group or a role. A managed policy is its own individual object in AWS that contains all of the permissions, and then it can be applied to multiple different identities. When you're looking at a policy, it's built of a statement or statements, which actually dictate what someone is allowed to do or not allowed to do. The first part of the statement is the effect, which says that someone is allowed to take an action or they're denied the ability to take an action. The next level down is the action or not action, and this is where we begin to see some potential issues with policies. An action is whitelisting. You are allowed to do this or this or this. A not action is blacklisting. You are not allowed to do this. The downside is if you start using not actions with an allow effect, you have basically stated that while a person cannot do whatever you've dictated, they can do anything else that they want. The next part of that, underneath the action or not action, is the service that's affected by this permission policy, whether that's identity and access management or EC2 or S3 or Route 53, whatever it may be. And then the next is the actual access, the permission that you're granting to that service. And these are broken into 4 or 5 different major types. The 4 common types are list, read, write, tagging. List is getting general information about the object. Read is actually reading detailed information from that object or sub-object. Writing, of course, is changing data. And tagging is modifying the tag attributes within AWS for different objects. And then depending on the service that you're applying the permission to, there's that other category, which could have any number of different permissions associated with it. The next part of the statement is the resource, and that is the specific item that the action can be taken on. And that could be one individual S3 bucket, or maybe it's multiple ones. And then the final part is a condition, which are special considerations. This could be that it requires MFA or something else to be able to be used at that moment. Now, one important thing to note is that by that service indication, I had a star, and that is a wildcard. And that star can be really placed anywhere within the service or access or resource. So you could say that somebody has access to all services or access to all permissions within that service, or their permissions are granted to all resources within a type. Really, it could be any one of those. And that's the second biggest issue that we see when it comes to permissions. For example, we have two policies here. The first one on the left is considered a well-formed and well-managed policy by AWS, and what we consider well-formed and well-managed. Within it, there are two different statements. The first statement says that anybody who has this policy is allowed to list all of the buckets. They can see the names of all buckets that exist for that AWS environment. The second statement is much more specific, and it states that they can perform any list or get actions on one specific bucket or anything underneath that bucket, the confidential data bucket. All right. And then on top of that, to be able to access that bucket, they had to have logged in with multi-factor. They had to have MFA to be able to do it. This is very, once again, distinct. The permissions get very granular. They're defined to very specific resources, even though the actions themselves tend to be fairly wildcard, right? Yes, no one can take write actions with this policy, but they can perform anything that falls within the list or get series of actions. Unfortunately, what we see more often is something like the policy on the right-hand side. Unlike the well-formed policy, what has happened here is instead of having multiple statements that give fine-grained control, we have one statement that has a whole bunch of actions all at once, right? So within this policy, they have the ability to do all the listing get actions for S3 buckets, as well as all the actions associated with EC2, and anything to do with CloudWatch, RDS, or Route 53 domains. And on top of that, they have the ability to change a password. Now, what probably was supposed to happen with this policy is that the user is able to change their own password. But unfortunately, because it's lumped together with all of those other actions, the resource has been listed as star because these resources spread the gamut from EC2 to S3 to RDS. What that means is anybody who has this policy has the ability to change anyone else's password within that AWS account. So in closing, let's kind of review those common configuration items you might see within policies that might be causing issues and granting more permissions than originally intended. The biggest one and the one that's easiest to lose track of is that single statement policy that spans multiple services. Yes, that might be intentional and it might be well formed within that policy, right, and applied to the right people. However, it's very easy to lose track of all the different services and different permissions that you've granted to those different services when they're all jumbled together. The next common item is the use of not actions with that allow effect. As I said, not actions are blacklisting, and when used in conjunction with allow, you could be inadvertently granting more permissions than you meant to be. And the last item is a problem mainly for when you're trying to review access within an AWS account, and that's by using inline policies. Once again, the only way to see the permissions applied in an inline policy is by looking at each individual identity and group and seeing what permissions have been embedded within it with that inline policy. The better methodology is to use a managed policy where you can review all the access at that level. However, there are some limitations with managed policies that may make you start using inline policies. Those limitations are that you can only have a maximum of 10 managed policies assigned to an identity. And the second is a policy can only have 6,000 plus characters in it, right? And that can go rather quickly. For example, our well-formed policy that we had in the previous slide had almost 500 characters in it.